My name is Daniel Cross. I'm 38 years old. I've been married to my wife, Eva, for nearly 8 years. And if you asked me a year ago what my life looked like, I would have said it was peaceful. Not perfect, but peaceful. I had a quiet job, managing a regional library system, and Eva ran her own small business out of our home. We weren't wealthy, but we were content. The only ache we carried was one we rarely spoke about. We couldn't have children, or at least that's what everyone assumed. Eva's family was old money, proud, polished, and painfully traditional. I was tolerated. Barely, to her mother. I was the polite, unremarkable man who'd married her daughter and failed to give her grandchildren. Every holiday with them was a chessboard of passive-aggressive comments, disguised as conversation. I learned to keep my head down, let the wine flow, and smile when the jabs came. But nothing prepared me for Christmas Eve dinner last year. The entire extended family was there. Cousins, aunts, uncles, some I hadn't even met before. Her mother, Eleanor, sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a banquet. The roast was still steaming when it began. She cleared her throat and tapped her wine glass. I thought she was going to give a toast. Instead, she said, "It's time we all acknowledged the elephant in the room. Daniel can't give Eva children. He's barren. I think it's time she divorced him and found someone who can." The silence was immediate. Then it rippled. A few uncomfortable chuckles. A nod from one of Eva's cousins. Her uncle muttered something about bloodlines under his breath. My hands didn't shake, but I felt the world tip slightly. I looked at Eva. Her face was unreadable. That terrified me more than anything Eleanor had said. And then Eva stood up. Slowly. Her voice was calm, but it had a weight I'd never heard before. She reached into her purse, pulled out a sealed envelope, and set it on the table. "Since everyone seems so interested in our reproductive journey," she said, "you might as well know we've been approved for triplets. We fly out in 2 weeks." The room gasped. And then she turned to me, eyes locked on mine. "And one more thing." Her voice lowered. "They're yours, Daniel. In every way that matters." The room went still. But something else had just begun. The next few minutes passed like a fog. I remember Eleanor's face pinched and pale, her hand tightening around her wine glass like it might steady the storm she had just created. But the storm never came from me. I didn't say a word. I didn't flinch. I sat there, stone still, while the weight of her accusation hovered like smoke over the roast and holly-sprinkled centerpiece. I could feel the shame she wanted me to wear, but I refused to pick it up. Later that night, after we left her parents' estate, Eva and I drove home in silence. Not angry silence, sacred silence. The kind that exists when two people know something huge has happened, but are too emotionally full to speak it yet. When we got home, I poured her tea, sat beside her on the couch, and she finally said, "I've been waiting for the right moment. But maybe this was it." Her voice cracked, just a little. "I'm sorry it had to be like that." I wasn't angry. That surprised me. What I felt was something deeper than anger. A quiet grief for how long I had swallowed my pride to belong to a family that never once saw me as whole. Every dinner, every passive remark, every fake smile, it had all been a transaction. I had tolerated their contempt, so Eva wouldn't have to choose. But I realized then she already had, and she had chosen me. Over the next few days, something in me changed. I found myself replaying not just that dinner, but every moment Eleanor had tried to undermine our marriage. How she would always accidentally leave out my name in family newsletters. How she once told Eva that some men are meant to support strong women, not lead them. And how she often reminded Eva of what she was giving up by staying with me. It wasn't about children. It never was. It was about control. And yet, I never fought back. I had believed that being the bigger man meant staying silent, but silence without boundaries is just surrender. That dinner didn't destroy me. It revealed how deeply I'd allowed someone else to narrate my worth. That realization did not burn with rage. It cooled into resolve. Eva and I didn't speak to her family for weeks after that night. Not a call, not a card. We focused on preparing the nursery, getting documents in order, and figuring out how to become parents to not one, but 3 children. But even as we built that future, I couldn't ignore a quiet need rising in me, not for revenge, but for reclamation. This wouldn't be loud, it wouldn't be cruel, but I was done playing the guest at a table I helped build. About a month after Christmas, while Eva was painting the nursery walls in soft earth tones, I quietly began my own preparation, not for parenthood, but for reclaiming my place. I didn't tell Eva, not because I wanted to hide it, but because this wasn't about drama. This was about setting something right in a language her mother would understand: legacy, respect, and control. And I planned to speak it fluently. Eleanor, for all her coldness, was consistent. Every year, she held a spring fundraiser at her estate, a formal garden event that gathered politicians, business owners, and society's favorite gatekeepers. Her charity, the Heritage League, was her crown jewel. She used it as a stage, a weapon, and a mirror to remind everyone of her influence. And it was her biggest weakness. That's where I would begin. You see, I wasn't just a librarian. Before that, I'd worked for a decade in non-profit finance, the kind of back-end roles that no one thanks you for but everyone depends on. I knew how funding structures worked. I knew how grant cycles move. And I knew how easily a public-facing non-profit could collapse if someone quietly pulled the wrong string. So I started digging. Public records, board filings, financial disclosures, all accessible, all ignored by the people who assumed no one ever looks. I found inconsistencies, donations that didn't align, endowment numbers that didn't match public reports. I didn't jump to conclusions. I printed everything, filed it carefully, and ran it by an old colleague in regulatory compliance. His words were simple: she's playing fast and loose. Could be ego, could be ignorance. Either way, it's sloppy and dangerous. I still didn't act. Not yet. I needed to understand her moves completely. So I started attending board meetings virtually, under a pseudonym, since the non-profit's bylaws allowed for open observers. I watched how she spoke, how others deferred to her, how she framed numbers with vague optimism but no detail. It was like watching a castle built on sand, regal on the outside, hollow underneath. Then came the moment I had been waiting for. Eleanor sent out a press release in early March, announcing a major expansion initiative for the Heritage League, a partnership with the state's Historical Commission and a matching donation drive. I knew she'd be desperate for big names and glowing reviews. So I reached out anonymously to a few watchdog journalists I trusted, just to ask questions, just to nudge their curiosity. And just like that, the quiet dominoes began to fall. It started subtly. A local columnist published a short piece titled, "Are We Overlooking Transparency in Local Charities?" It didn't name Eleanor, but it referenced the Heritage League's newest expansion push and questioned where certain numbers were coming from. Within a week, another article followed. This one dug deeper. It mentioned misaligned grant figures and inconsistent board reports. Still no names, but the air around Eleanor's fundraiser began to shift. She didn't notice at first, or maybe she did, and refused to admit it. Her social media pages stayed bright, her public speeches cheerful, But behind closed doors, the league's board was asking questions. I knew, because one of the junior members, someone I'd once mentored during a literacy program, sent me a text. "You might have started something. She's panicking quietly." I didn't reply. That silence was part of the plan. By mid-April, an official inquiry was opened by the State Non-Profit Council. Eleanor's fundraiser was still scheduled, but the sponsors began to withdraw. First it was the bank, then the local foundation, then the mayor's office, which politely declined to attend. Eleanor sent out frantic updates, trying to stabilize her ship. But the press had caught wind of a bigger story now, and her silence only made the curiosity sharper. Still, I never appeared, not once. No statement, no comment. I watched it unfold, like someone watching a garden finally free itself of the weeds. Eva noticed the articles, of course. One night, she looked up from her tablet and asked, "Did you have anything to do with this?" I looked her in the eyes and answered, "Only what needed to be done." She didn't ask again. She simply nodded and went back to rubbing her belly, humming softly to the future growing within her. And then, the public unraveling began. A former employee of the League, someone who'd resigned years ago after being dismissed as ungrateful, wrote an op-ed in a major paper. She told of mismanagement, silenced concerns, and Eleanor's obsession with appearances over impact. The floodgates opened. The League's website quietly went offline 2 days later. Eleanor issued a single, sterile statement, blaming a miscommunication and clerical oversight. No apology, no ownership. But the damage had been done. Her empire of mirrors had shattered, not with a crash, but with a slow, deliberate crack that no one could unsee. She never suspected me, and that was the point. The fundraiser was cancelled 2 days before the event. Officially, they blamed logistical difficulties. Unofficially, no one wanted to be seen near Eleanor. Her name, once synonymous with class and tradition, had become radioactive in the circles she once ruled. Invitations stopped arriving, calls stopped being returned. Even the charity's longest-standing allies issued polite statements distancing themselves from the scandal. Eleanor had become exactly what she feared most: irrelevant. I never gloated. I didn't need to. Watching the world she built crumble under its own weight was enough. There was no scene, no confrontation, no final shouting match where I declared my vengeance. Just silence. A complete and total absence of the man she once mocked. That was the most devastating reply I could give her. My absence. Meanwhile, our home became louder, with hope. The triplets arrived mid-June, 2 boys and a girl, Elijah, Jonah, and Barren. They were beautiful, not biologically mine, perhaps, but in every sense that mattered. They were my children. Late-night feedings, soft lullabies, the way Barren would wrap her tiny hand around my thumb like it was the whole world. I became a father, not through blood, but through presence. Eleanor sent a single card after they arrived. No note, no apology. Just a monogrammed envelope with their names typed out neatly and 3 silver bookmarks for their baby books. Eva tossed it into a drawer. I didn't say anything. It was over. The fight, the silence, the power games, all of it. I had taken back my dignity, and now I had better things to hold. But the world has a way of echoing what you no longer need. A few months later, I was invited to speak at a conference on ethical non-profit practices. One of the organizers had read the op-ed that started it all. They didn't know my name, but they wanted someone who understood quiet accountability. I accepted, not for recognition, but because there's power in sharing what silence can teach. I walked into that room with calm, clear purpose, the same quiet strength I had once used to hold in pain. I now used to teach protection of values, of vision, of self-worth. And as I closed my talk, I said one thing that left the room still. Sometimes the loudest justice is done in silence. You don't have to destroy anyone, just stop letting them destroy you. That's what I had done, and that's when I knew I was free. There's a strange stillness that follows resolution. Not emptiness, not the ache of revenge unfulfilled, but peace. A kind that doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand applause. It just arrives, like quiet rain after a storm. That's how I felt in the months after everything settled. Eva and I had built something sacred out of the ashes they tried to pour over us. And that feeling, that grounded wholeness, was something no apology or public collapse could ever provide. Our evenings became sacred rituals. Bottles, bedtime stories, and soft music humming from the nursery. I learned how to swaddle with one hand and how to function on 4 hours of broken sleep. But more than that, I learned who I really was without the pressure of being good enough for someone else's standards. Eleanor's rejection had once defined the edges of my self-worth. Not anymore. Her voice no longer echoed in my decisions, my parenting, or my presence. It's interesting, the people who once stood closest to her began reaching out. Cousins, distant relatives, even her own sister, who hadn't spoken to her in years. Some apologized quietly for that Christmas dinner. Others just wanted to reconnect. But none of them asked me how I took her down. That wasn't what they respected. What they saw was my silence, my restraint, my refusal to degrade myself in the same way she had tried to degrade me. I never rubbed salt in the wound. I didn't need to. My success, my family, my calm, that was the response. I showed them, through action, that you don't need to shout to rise. You don't need to retaliate to reclaim. You only need to know who you are, and never forget it, even when others try to write over you with their own insecurities. Eva, for her part, blossomed in motherhood. She often told me how proud she was, not of how I got back at her mother, but of how I carried myself through it. You didn't change, she said. You just stopped shrinking. That meant more than anything. Because it was true, I hadn't become someone else to get through this. I had simply removed the weight of other people's opinions from my shoulders, and with that weight gone, I started dreaming again. Not just surviving, not just defending, but building, planning, imagining a future that had nothing to do with proving myself, and everything to do with becoming myself. Freedom didn't come like fireworks, it came in quiet moments. Like when Elijah fell asleep on my chest for the first time, and I realized I didn't care whose blood ran through his veins, or when I caught myself laughing uncontrollably with Eva on the kitchen floor at 2 a.m., bottles scattered around us, the chaos of parenthood drowning out every voice that ever told us we weren't enough. Those were the victories no one could see, and they mattered more than the headlines ever could. I began writing again. Something I hadn't done in years. Short essays at first, reflections on resilience, on dignity, on what it means to walk through fire without burning your soul. I posted them anonymously on a blog, not expecting anyone to read them, but people did. A lot of them. Messages started pouring in, from strangers, from other men quietly carrying wounds they weren't allowed to name. They didn't want vengeance, they wanted validation, and I gave it to them, one sentence at a time. One message stood out. It was from a man named Henry. He wrote, "I stayed quiet while my wife's family slowly dismantled my self-worth. I didn't leave. I just stopped existing. Reading your words made me want to exist again. Thank you." I read that line 5 times, then I printed it and taped it to the inside of my journal. That was the moment I understood. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It was medicine. Eva encouraged me to keep going. She called it my quiet ministry. I liked that. It reminded me that justice doesn't always have to be sharp. Sometimes it's gentle, restorative, a healing ripple instead of a destructive wave. That's the kind of man I wanted to be, the kind who heals by simply standing whole in a world that expects you to crumble. Meanwhile, Eleanor had retreated. She sold the estate, moved to a smaller house near her sister. Occasionally, someone would mention seeing her at a bookstore or church event, but she kept a low profile. I never reached out. She never apologized. And that, too, was part of the peace. I no longer needed closure from someone who didn't have the capacity to give it. Forgiveness, I learned, isn't something you give when someone deserves it. It's something you offer yourself when you're ready to stop bleeding for someone else's wounds. And I was ready. There's a specific kind of strength that forms when you've walked through public humiliation and chosen not to become bitter. It's not the kind of strength people applaud. It's quieter than that. It shows up in how you hold yourself when someone speaks down to you, in how you no longer shrink for the comfort of others. It shows up in how you protect your peace like it's sacred, because it is. By the children's first birthday, we had fully settled into a rhythm. Eva and I weren't the same couple we were before Christmas. We were stronger, not because we had fought louder, but because we had loved deeper. We had held the line, protected what mattered, and watched the lies fall apart on their own. When people ask me now how we made it through that chapter, I never mention strategy or revenge. I talk about values and silence and time. I was invited to consult for a non-profit network later that year to help audit and advise on ethical leadership practices. The irony wasn't lost on me. I, the man once deemed too passive to lead a family, was now being trusted to preserve legacies bigger than money. It reminded me of a truth I'd long forgotten. Character always outlasts charisma. And while people like Eleanor rise fast, they fall just as quickly when there's no substance beneath the sparkle. One afternoon, while walking Barren through the park in her stroller, an older woman approached me, sharp eyes, careful words. "You're Daniel, aren't you? Eleanor's son-in-law." I nodded cautiously. She didn't smile, but she said, "I saw what you did, or didn't do. That kind of discipline, not many have it. You changed the tone of this town." Then she walked away. Just like that. No further conversation, but her words stayed with me. I hadn't set out to change anything. I had only wanted to protect my dignity, my marriage, my peace. But maybe that's how real change begins, not with grand gestures, but with one person refusing to accept humiliation as normal. One person choosing patience over performance. One man showing that being underestimated is not a weakness, it's a position of quiet power if you know how to hold it. I went home that day and kissed Eva's forehead while she fed Jonah. She smiled without even looking up and whispered, "You look lighter." And I was, because for the first time in a long, long time, I wasn't carrying anything that didn't belong to me. Peace, I've learned, doesn't mean life gets quieter. It means the noise no longer controls you. There's still chaos. 3 toddlers ensure that there are still hard days, long nights, and unexpected challenges. But there's a core inside me now that doesn't flinch when people raise their voices or point fingers. That part of me was built slowly, forged in fire and kept alive through silence. And now, nothing shakes it. One of the most surprising things that happened was Eva's shift. Not in her love for me, that never wavered, but in how she showed up for herself. Watching her watch me taught her something. She said it herself one night after putting the kids to sleep. "Your silence taught me what dignity looks like," she said. And I realized I've spent most of my life asking my mother for permission to be myself. That night she wrote a letter to Eleanor, not cruel, not cold, just final. She never sent it, but she didn't need to. There was a new softness in our home. Not weakness, softness. That kind of strong, stable warmth that only exists when two people have walked through fire and chosen each other on the other side. We didn't talk about Eleanor anymore. We didn't need to. Our life had expanded beyond the reach of her shadow. We weren't reacting to her anymore. We were building our own sun. I started teaching part-time again, guest lecturing at local colleges about ethics, integrity, and leadership. It wasn't glamorous, but it was meaningful. I told students the truth. Power will tempt you to be loud, but real influence comes from consistency, from restraint, from knowing who you are when no one is clapping. Some nodded, others looked confused, but a few, the quiet ones in the back, they understood. Sometimes when I walk past the mirror, I catch a glimpse of the man I've become. He's older, yes, more lines around the eyes, but stronger, calmer. He doesn't chase acceptance anymore. He doesn't hand his worth to people who only know how to break it. And the younger version of me, the one who used to sit through family dinners, smiling through humiliation, he'd be proud of this version. He'd finally feel safe in his own skin. And as for Eleanor, I don't hate her. I don't think about her much. Not out of avoidance, but out of healing. You can't carry love and resentment in the same hand. Eventually you have to choose. I chose love. Not for her, but for myself, for my wife, for our children, for the life we built, not in defiance of her, but in quiet defiance of the need for her approval. By the end of that year, I found myself walking through our home and seeing evidence of redemption in every room. The nursery, once a symbol of longing, had become a sacred mess of toys, blankets, and tiny socks we could never seem to find in pairs. The dining room, once filled with tense holiday conversations, was now the stage for spontaneous toddler concerts and Sunday pancakes. And our bedroom, quiet, simple, felt like a sanctuary again. The heaviness that used to linger in the walls had lifted. We had reclaimed our space. Eva surprised me on our anniversary with a small gathering, just close friends, no extended family, no pageantry. After dinner she stood up and toasted to surviving the year we never saw coming. Then she looked at me, glass trembling slightly, and said, "Daniel, you didn't just protect this family, you built it. One silent act at a time." I didn't cry, but I felt something move inside me, like a part of my heart finally exhaled. I think back often to that moment at the Christmas table, how small I felt, how many eyes stared at me with quiet judgment, how even the air seemed too sharp to breathe. And then I think of now. I think of the calm that replaced the chaos. The way our children look at me like I am their entire world. The way Eva reaches for my hand in her sleep. I think of all that was nearly stolen from me, had I allowed one woman's bitterness to shape the story. Sometimes people ask me if I ever confronted Eleanor. The answer is no. Because when you've truly healed, confrontation feels unnecessary. The truth has already done its work, and the people who once doubted you, they're watching, not to see you fail, but to understand how you didn't. My silence said what my words never could. I didn't need to destroy her. I just needed to remain. And I did. The children are growing fast now. Elijah is obsessed with puzzles. Jonah sings to himself while he colors. And Barren, she's fiercely curious, always watching, always learning. One night she placed her tiny hand on my face and said, "Daddy's strong." She didn't know what that meant, not yet. But one day she will. One day, all three of them will know that their father stood up for them long before they could stand. Not by shouting, not by fighting, but by never disappearing. The more time passed, the more I realized the real victory wasn't that Eleanor lost influence. It's that I no longer needed her approval to breathe freely. That grip she held over our lives, that unspoken control she wielded in every glance and every whisper, it vanished when we stopped playing her game. And the silence I once used to survive became the space where I finally started to live. I found joy in things I used to rush past. The sound of the kettle boiling in the morning while the kids still slept. The way Eva danced barefoot in the hallway, hair messy, humming lullabies she made up on the spot. The way Barren would lay her head on my shoulder after a tantrum and breathe like she trusted the world again. These were not loud victories, but they were sacred, and they were mine. One afternoon I received a letter in the mail, cream-colored, elegant script from Eleanor. It wasn't an apology, it wasn't even a request, it simply read, "I heard about your lectures, people speak well of you, I hope you'll keep doing something meaningful." That was it. No warmth, no ownership, but also no venom. For a moment I sat with it, not angry, not moved, just still. Then I tucked the letter into the back of a drawer and closed it. That chapter was over. What surprised me most was that I didn't feel vindicated. I felt unburdened, like someone who had been carrying a story too long and finally decided to set it down. That's what forgiveness becomes in the end, not permission for someone to hurt you again, but a choice to stop retelling the pain to yourself, to stop shrinking every time their name is mentioned, to remember who you were before the wound. At one of my last guest lectures that year, a student raised her hand and asked, "How do you know when you've finally healed?" I smiled, thought for a moment, and said, "When the story still lives inside you, but no longer needs to be the loudest voice in the room." The class went silent, and in that silence, I saw understanding bloom. That's the legacy I want to leave. Not revenge, not silence as punishment, but strength as presence, integrity as power, and dignity, always dignity, even when no one's watching. It's strange how life circles back in quiet, graceful ways. Last Christmas, exactly 1 year from the night everything changed. We celebrated at home, just us and the kids. No tension, no expectations, just warmth, laughter, and the kind of joy that doesn't need to be earned. Eva baked too much. The triplets tore wrapping paper like it was a competition. And I sat back, holding a mug of coffee, watching the chaos unfold like it was a symphony written just for me. Eva handed me a small box. Inside was a leather-bound journal, the kind I used to carry when I was younger. On the first page, in her handwriting, she'd written, "For the man who taught this family the strength of silence." I couldn't speak for a while. I just held it in my hands, not because of what it was, but because of what it meant. She saw me. She always had. That night, after the kids were asleep and the dishes put away, I sat by the window, the journal in my lap. I opened it and began to write. Not about Eleanor, not about betrayal, but about peace, about growth. About the way healing sneaks in like morning light and softens everything it touches. I wrote about the man I used to be, unsure, shrinking, waiting to be chosen, and the man I had become, steady, whole, free. I no longer needed a final word with Eleanor. No dramatic confrontation. No closure delivered across a table like some cinematic climax. I had already spoken my truth in the life I was living, in the father I had become, in the way Eva looked at me like home. My revenge had never been in her downfall. It had always been in our rise. And so I let go. Not with bitterness, not with triumph, just release. The kind of letting go that happens when you finally realize you never needed to prove yourself in the first place, when you understand that the people who matter never asked you to be anyone but who you are. My name is Daniel Cross. I am a husband, a father, a man who chose quiet over chaos, dignity over reaction, and peace over pride. And in the end, I didn't lose anything. I gained everything, because I never let them steal who I was becoming. And that was enough. That was more than enough.